Discrimination and bias lead to one of the employees at a car dealership making a huge mistake. But Jason Henderson isn't one to let it go without consequences. Get ready to see how one event will change an entire industry. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the stories that reveal the truth. Where did you first encounter prejudice? Write it in the comments. Jason Henderson stepped out of his car, his casual sneakers lightly touching the polished pavement outside the dealership. A cool breeze ruffled his neatly cropped hair as he took a deep breath and adjusted his simple, well-worn jacket. It was a jacket that had seen better days, but Jason favored it. It reminded him of simpler times, times when he hadn't yet built an empire. Today he wasn't here as the billionaire owner of one of the largest car dealership chains in the country. Today, he was just Jason, a man looking to purchase a car, but with a specific plan in mind. Jason wasn't an ordinary customer, and though he carried the weight of his success on his shoulders, he preferred to remain grounded. He didn't believe in flaunting his wealth, despite the multi-million-dollar businesses under his name. The irony of his situation amused him. A man who owned an entire chain of luxury car dealerships, walking into a competitor's showroom to experience what it felt like to be on the other side. Incognito. His journey to success had been far from easy. Growing up in a modest, working-class black family, Jason had learned early on that the world wasn't fair, especially to people who looked like him. His parents, hard-working middle-class folks, had instilled in him the importance of diligence, respect, and perseverance. His mother had been a school teacher, and his father worked as a factory supervisor. They made sure that Jason and his siblings knew the value of hard work. But even with those values, the road was fraught with obstacles. Jason had encountered discrimination at every corner, from the playground as a child to the boardrooms as a business owner. He remembered one particular incident during his teenage years that had stuck with him. He had been 17, excited about a job interview at a local garage, and the owner had practically laughed in his face when he walked in. "You really think you're cut out for this, kid?" the man had asked, looking Jason up and down like he was some lost stray. The job had gone to someone else, of course. Someone who didn't have to work twice as hard to prove themselves just because of the color of their skin. That was one of many moments that had shaped him, made him stronger. And now, here he was, a self-made billionaire, but still battling the same preconceptions from people who couldn't see past his appearance. That was the reason he had decided to visit this particular dealership, to observe firsthand how they treated someone who, in their eyes, didn't fit the profile of a wealthy client. As he pushed open the glass doors to the showroom, Jason took in the atmosphere. The dealership was the epitome of luxury. Shiny, chrome-finished cars stood proudly on display, their polished surfaces gleaming under the soft, warm lights. The floors were made of sleek black marble that sparkled under the sunlight streaming in from the massive windows. Around the room, plush leather seating areas were arranged for clients to relax while browsing, and on the far side, he could see a coffee bar where wealthy patrons could sip cappuccinos while discussing their next six-figure purchase. Jason stood for a moment, absorbing the scene. The air was thick with the scent of new leather and the faint trace of fresh paint. This was a place designed to make its clients feel important, like royalty. But Jason could already feel the invisible eyes on him, eyes that assessed, judged, and dismissed him in the same breath. He had seen this before. People judged others based on the most superficial things: clothes, shoes, skin color. It was an old story for him, but it still stung. Dressed in jeans, sneakers, and his old jacket, Jason didn't look like someone who belonged in such an upscale environment. And that was the point. He wanted to see how they would treat him without knowing who he really was. His hands slid into his pockets as he strolled through the showroom, glancing at the cars on display. The latest models of luxury sedans and sports cars were lined up like trophies, each one boasting its exorbitant price tag. He noticed a few salesmen in tailored suits, busy fawning over other customers, wealthy-looking individuals, most of whom were white, dressed in designer clothes dripping with wealth. These customers were given the full royal treatment, polite smiles, enthusiastic handshakes, and unbroken attention. Jason observed as one salesman stood beside a couple, explaining the features of a sleek black sedan, his voice filled with the excitement of making a potential sale. Jason, meanwhile, wandered around unnoticed. He didn't mind. In fact, he had expected it. These kinds of places were built on the assumption that appearances equaled status. He could have walked in wearing a tailored suit, flashing his expensive watch, and he knew they would have tripped over themselves to offer him service. But that wasn't the test he was here to conduct. No, he wanted to see how they treated someone who didn't look the part, someone they deemed unworthy of their time. As he continued his walk through the showroom, his thoughts drifted back to his childhood. He could still hear his mother's voice, softly reminding him every night that he was capable of achieving anything he set his mind to. "Don't let them tell you otherwise, Jason," she would say, tucking him into bed after a long day at school. "You're just as good, if not better, than anyone else out there. But you'll have to work harder for it, son. You'll have to prove yourself over and over again, but don't ever let them break your spirit." Those words had stayed with him. They were a shield against the world's harsh judgment. And now, after years of struggle, after building an empire from the ground up, Jason was ready to prove a point once again. Not for himself, but for those who came after him, for every young black boy or girl who would walk into a room and be judged before they even opened their mouth. He stopped in front of a sleek red sports car, admiring the smooth lines and elegant design. This was the kind of car he could have easily added to his collection, but that wasn't why he was here. He smiled to himself, knowing what was about to unfold. His fingers lightly touched the car's door handle, feeling the cold metal beneath his skin. In the corner of his eye, he noticed a salesman glance his way, then quickly look away, clearly uninterested. Jason waited for a few moments, expecting someone to approach him, but no one did. The salesmen were still preoccupied with their more deserving customers. He wasn't surprised. This was a test he had seen play out countless times. It was a silent challenge to see how long they would ignore him, how long they would treat him as if he didn't belong. But Jason wasn't here to complain or to expose their bias just yet. No, he had learned long ago that patience was key. He would let them show their true colors first. After a few minutes, Jason finally decided to approach one of the salesmen. He walked over to a tall, clean-cut man in his mid-40s who was engaged in a lively conversation with a well-dressed couple. Jason waited politely, not interrupting, until the man glanced at him with a brief flicker of annoyance. "Excuse me," Jason said, his tone calm and composed. "I'm interested in the red model over there. Can I take a closer look?" The salesman, whose name tag read Tom, barely concealed his disdain as he gave Jason a quick once-over. His eyes lingered on Jason's worn jacket and casual jeans. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips, the kind of smile that said he didn't take Jason seriously at all. "You know," Tom said, his voice dripping with condescension. "That's one of our more exclusive models. Are you sure that's the car you're looking for?" Jason raised an eyebrow, but his expression remained neutral. "I'm sure," he said evenly. "I'd like to see it up close." Tom hesitated, his smile fading slightly as he shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Well," he said, still maintaining his air of superiority, "that car goes for over $200,000. It's not exactly for everyone." Jason didn't blink. "That's fine. I'll still take a look." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly unamused. "Let me check if it's available," he muttered, before turning on his heel and walking away. Jason watched him go, a faint smile playing on his lips. He knew exactly what was happening. They had written him off from the moment he walked in the door. They saw his skin color, his clothes, and decided he wasn't worth their time. But they didn't know him. Not yet. As Jason stood waiting, he thought about the many times he had been underestimated throughout his life. From the moment he had stepped into the professional world, people had doubted his abilities, questioned his intelligence, and made assumptions based on nothing more than his appearance. But every time he had proven them wrong. He had fought for his place at the table, not with aggression or anger, but with perseverance and hard work. And this was no different. In this elite dealership, surrounded by wealth and privilege, Jason was about to teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Jason stood quietly by the red sports car, his hands resting loosely in his pockets as he watched Tom walk away. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jason maintained his calm exterior, the smile on his face a mere mask. Inside, however, a familiar frustration began to bubble. He'd been here before, many times, in fact, judged and dismissed by people like Tom, who thought they could assess someone's worth based on nothing but appearance. But Jason had learned to control his emotions, to hold back his anger until the right moment. And that moment would come soon enough. He glanced around the dealership, taking in the environment once more. The luxury oozed from every corner, polished cars, sparkling floors, and well-dressed salespeople who were busy catering to the needs of their affluent customers. Everything was designed to create an air of exclusivity, to make their clients feel like they were part of an elite club. But as Jason observed, he saw the truth behind the facade, a place where people were judged not by their character, but by the brand of their shoes, the cut of their suits, and, in his case, the color of their skin. Across the room, Tom was speaking with another salesman, gesturing subtly in Jason's direction. Jason could see their exchange, the quiet laughter, the dismissive glances. He wasn't surprised. It was a pattern he had experienced more times than he could count. But he didn't come here for a fight. Not yet. Today was about patience. He would let them reveal themselves, and then, when the time was right, he'd show them who he really was. As he waited, his mind drifted back to his past, to the many instances where he had been in similar situations. There was the time he had been passed over for a promotion, even though he was the most qualified candidate, simply because the company didn't think a young black man could lead a team of engineers. He had taken that rejection and turned it into motivation, leaving the company to start his own business. Now, that business had grown into a nationwide empire, and the very company that had dismissed him years ago had come begging for a partnership. But that success hadn't come easy. Jason had faced rejection, discrimination, and prejudice at every turn. He had learned to stay calm, to bide his time, and to use those experiences as fuel for his ambition. And today was no different. He was in control, and he knew exactly how this was going to play out. "Still waiting, huh?" A voice interrupted his thoughts. Jason turned to see a different salesman approaching. This one younger, maybe in his early 30s, with slicked back hair and an expensive-looking watch on his wrist. He had a smirk on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes, and his gaze flickered briefly over Jason's clothes before landing on the car. "You need help with something?" the man asked, his tone casual but laced with condescension. It was clear he didn't take Jason seriously. "I asked Tom if I could see the red model up close," Jason replied, keeping his voice steady. "He said he was going to check if it's available." The salesman raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Tom's busy with another customer right now. But I'm happy to help. Though," he trailed off, giving Jason another quick once-over. "That car's a bit high-end, don't you think?" Jason felt the familiar surge of frustration but kept it in check. "I'm aware of the price," he said calmly. "I'd still like to take a look." The salesman chuckled under his breath, clearly not believing that Jason was a serious buyer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, dangling them lazily between his fingers. "Sure thing, buddy. Let's take a look." Jason followed him over to the car, his face still neutral. The salesman unlocked the door with a casual flick of the wrist and stood back, clearly waiting for Jason to step inside. "Go ahead," the salesman said, the smirk still playing on his lips. "Take a seat. See how it feels to be behind the wheel of something like this." Jason could hear the unspoken implication in his words. "You don't belong here. You don't deserve this." But he didn't react. Instead, he opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, his fingers lightly gripping the steering wheel. The leather was soft, smooth, and the dashboard gleamed with the latest technology. It was a beautiful car, no doubt. But Jason wasn't here for the car. He was here for the experience. The experience of being treated like less than what he was, simply because of assumptions made by people who couldn't see beyond his appearance. The salesman stood by the door, tapping his foot impatiently, clearly eager to move on. "So," he said after a moment, "how does it feel? You think you're going to drive something like this out of here today?" Jason looked up at him, his face calm, but his eyes sharp. "Maybe," he said simply, leaving the salesman momentarily speechless. There was an awkward pause as the salesman shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to customers like Jason. In his mind, people who looked like Jason didn't belong in a place like this. They didn't buy cars like this. And yet here Jason was, seated in one of the most expensive models in the showroom, showing no sign of discomfort or insecurity. "All right," the salesman said finally, his smirk faltering. "I'll leave you to it. Take your time." Jason watched him walk away, the same way Tom had earlier. He wasn't surprised by any of this. It was the same song and dance he had seen his entire life. People like Tom, people like this other salesman, they all operated on the same set of assumptions. But today, Jason had no intention of letting them get away with it. As he sat in the car, the plush leather beneath him, Jason's thoughts turned inward again. He remembered his early days in the automotive industry. Back then, he'd been just another mechanic, working in a small shop, trying to make a name for himself. He had loved cars since he was a kid, spending hours with his father, fixing up old models in their garage. But breaking into the business side of things had been nearly impossible. Every door he knocked on had been slammed in his face, every opportunity met with skepticism because he didn't fit the mold of what a successful businessman was supposed to look like. It was those rejections that had fueled his desire to start his own company. He had built his first dealership from the ground up, using every dollar he had saved and every connection he had made. Slowly, he began to expand, first opening a second location, then a third. Before long, his chain of dealerships had spread across the country, catering to all kinds of clients. And yet, despite his success, he still encountered people like Tom and the younger salesman, who looked at him and saw nothing more than a man who didn't belong. Jason knew that people like them wouldn't change overnight. It was deeply ingrained in them, this belief that worth was tied to appearance. But that didn't mean they couldn't be taught a lesson. A few minutes passed, and Jason decided to step out of the car. As he closed the door, he noticed Tom walking toward him again, this time with a forced smile on his face. It was the kind of smile that came when someone was trying to mask their disdain. But it was too late. Jason had already seen his true face. "Sorry about the wait," Tom said, though his tone suggested he wasn't really sorry at all. "We've been quite busy today. So have you decided if this is the car for you?" Jason met his gaze evenly. "I'm still thinking about it," he said, "but I have a few questions about the financing options." Tom's expression barely flickered, but Jason could see the impatience in his eyes. "Of course," Tom said, his voice clipped. "But I should let you know we usually cater to clients who are, well, prepared for the kind of commitment that a car like this requires." Jason's smile didn't waver. "I understand that. I'm more than prepared." For a moment, Tom seemed unsure of how to respond. He was clearly used to brushing off people like Jason with thinly veiled condescension. But Jason wasn't reacting the way he had expected. There was no defensiveness, no anger, just a quiet confidence that seemed to unsettle Tom. "Well," Tom said, his tone growing colder, "let's make sure we're on the same page. This isn't the kind of purchase you can walk into lightly. Are you certain this is something you can handle?" The words hung in the air, and for a brief second, Jason felt his control waver. But he quickly regained it, his expression remaining calm. He had been in this position too many times to let it rattle him now. "I appreciate your concern," Jason replied, his voice steady. "But I think I'm more than capable of handling it." Tom's eyes flashed with irritation, but he didn't push further. Instead, he nodded curtly. "Very well. I'll get the paperwork started." As Tom walked away, Jason felt the weight of the situation settle over him. He knew exactly what Tom thought of him. He could feel the judgment, the disdain, the quiet conviction that Jason wasn't worthy of being in this showroom, let alone buying one of the most expensive cars on the lot. But that was exactly what Jason wanted, for them to show their hand, to reveal their biases. He glanced at the car one more time, a silent resolve hardening in his chest. This was only the beginning. Tom and the others didn't know it yet, but they were about to learn a valuable lesson about assumptions, one they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Jason watched as Tom strode away, the man's back stiff with arrogance, his expensive suit cutting a sharp line through the gleaming rows of cars. There was a certain rhythm to this place, a quiet hum of wealth, privilege, and superiority that pulsed beneath the polished surfaces and luxury features. Jason had felt the temperature rise from the moment he'd walked through the doors, but now the heat was about to reach its boiling point. He stood by the red sports car, his hand resting on the sleek metal of the hood. It was cool to the touch, a stark contrast to the simmering frustration building within him. Jason had played this game long enough to know how it would go. They would continue to doubt him, dismiss him, and disrespect him, right up until the moment they realized who he really was. But this time, it was different. He wasn't here to simply be acknowledged. He was here to expose them, to show how people like Tom and the rest of the staff treated those they deemed unworthy. His patience, though deep, was wearing thin. A few minutes later, Tom returned, holding a tablet in his hand. His smile was no longer just condescending. It was laced with irritation. "All right, mister." Tom trailed off, clearly having forgotten Jason's last name, though he had never actually bothered to ask for it. "Henderson," Jason supplied calmly. "Yes, Mr. Henderson. I've pulled up the paperwork for you, but, as I mentioned earlier, this is a high-end vehicle. Our financing options are designed for clients who have certain financial capabilities." The way Tom said the word clients was deliberate, pointed. His eyes flickered to Jason's worn jacket once more, and the subtext was clear. "You don't belong here." Jason nodded, keeping his face neutral. "I understand." Tom tapped the screen of his tablet, scrolling through the numbers with a quick, practiced motion. "Now, we're looking at an initial down payment of $50,000, followed by monthly payments, assuming you qualify for our financing options. Of course, there's also the option to pay in full, but I imagine that's not something you're considering." The comment was cutting, a not-so-subtle jab at Jason's presumed financial standing. Jason's lips tightened, but he remained composed. He had expected this. He had anticipated every step of this process, and Tom was following the script perfectly. "I think I'll decide once I see the full breakdown," Jason replied smoothly. Tom blinked, clearly thrown by Jason's confidence. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, a large figure loomed in the corner of Jason's eye. It was the security guard, the same one who had been shadowing him since the moment he walked in. The guard was tall and broad, his arms crossed over his chest in a way that made it clear he wasn't here to offer help. His gaze was cold, suspicious, and locked directly on Jason. The tension in the air thickened as the guard took a step forward, his presence commanding attention. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice low and gruff. Tom looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment, but Jason could see the gears turning behind his eyes. This was escalating quicker than even he had expected. "No problem at all," Jason said calmly, meeting the guard's gaze evenly. "Just discussing some details about this car." The guard didn't move. He stood there, his posture tense, as if waiting for Jason to make a wrong move. The unspoken accusation was clear. "You don't belong here. You're a threat." Jason had seen this play out before. A black man in a luxury environment. Immediate suspicion, immediate hostility, but he wasn't going to be intimidated. Not here, not now. Tom, sensing the unease, cleared his throat awkwardly. "It's fine, Marcus," he said to the guard, though his tone lacked conviction. "Mr. Henderson is just asking a few questions." Jason didn't miss the way Tom hesitated before saying his name. He could feel the disdain radiating from both men, thinly veiled behind polite words. The guard, Marcus, didn't leave. He stayed close, his eyes narrowed, watching Jason's every move, as if he expected him to suddenly turn violent. Jason clenched his jaw, the frustration inside him building. He had dealt with this kind of treatment all his life, from security guards in shopping malls, from police officers pulling him over for no reason, from strangers crossing the street when they saw him walking their way. And now, here he was, a billionaire, yet still treated as a threat because of the color of his skin. "Is there anything else you need from me?" Jason asked Tom, his voice carefully measured. Tom glanced at Marcus, then back at Jason. No, I think we've covered, everything. But, just to be clear, we do need confirmation that you can make the down payment before we proceed any further. You understand, right?" Jason felt the sting of the words, though they were coated in feigned professionalism. It wasn't about the down payment. It wasn't about the car. It was about the assumption that because he didn't fit their narrow image of what a wealthy person should look like, he couldn't possibly afford it. Jason's patience was hanging by a thread. "I understand," Jason said, his voice icy. He locked eyes with Tom, and for the first time the salesman seemed to sense the shift in Jason's demeanor. The tension was thick now, a palpable force in the air. Marcus still hovered nearby, watching, waiting. Jason could feel the weight of their combined scrutiny pressing down on him, but he wouldn't break. Not here, not for them. Tom tapped a few more times on his tablet, clearly stalling. "All right then. I'll just give you a few more minutes to think it over," he said, his voice faltering slightly. Jason nodded, but he didn't look at Tom. His eyes were fixed on Marcus, the security guard, who was still standing too close for comfort. There was a challenge in Jason's gaze, daring Marcus to say something, to make the next move. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Jason knew that both men were waiting for him to leave, waiting for him to give up, to walk out of the dealership quietly and without incident. But that wasn't going to happen. Just as Jason was about to respond, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir. Is there an issue here?" A middle-aged white man, another salesman from the dealership, had approached. His sharp suit and neatly combed hair gave off an air of seniority. He glanced between Jason and Marcus, and the unease in his expression was obvious. Jason looked at him, his expression unreadable. "No issue," he replied, though the weight of what had just transpired hung in the air. The new salesman shifted awkwardly. "Mr. Henderson, if there's anything I can assist you with." Jason's jaw tightened. The situation was escalating, and he could feel it in the way every eye in the room was suddenly on him. The staff, the other customers, even the other security guards. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. It was as if the entire dealership had collectively decided that Jason was no longer a potential customer, but a problem to be dealt with. Jason exhaled slowly, the rage simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to shout, to call them out for their blatant discrimination. But he knew that wasn't the way to win, not here, not like this. "I appreciate your help," Jason said, his voice cold but controlled. "But I think I've seen enough for today." He turned to walk away, but Marcus, the security guard, stepped forward, his hand hovering near his radio. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave," he said, his voice firm. Jason paused, disbelief washing over him. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't been aggressive, hadn't caused any disruption. Yet here he was, being treated as if he were a criminal. "Leave," Jason repeated, his voice low, dangerous. "Yes," Marcus replied, his expression hard. "We've had complaints." Jason felt his blood run cold. Complaints. He hadn't spoken to anyone except the salesman. There was no reason, no justification for this. This wasn't about his behavior. It was about his presence. The mere fact that he was here, in a place they didn't think he belonged, was enough to make him a problem. He clenched his fists, fighting to keep his composure. What complaints? Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. The message was clear. You're not welcome here. For a long moment, Jason just stood there, the rage boiling inside him. But he knew that if he reacted, if he gave them any reason to believe he was dangerous, it would only confirm their suspicions. So instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. "I'll leave," Jason said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't over." With that, He turned and walked out of the dealership, the weight of their judgment pressing down on him with every step. As the glass doors closed behind him, Jason stopped, standing still in the bright sunlight outside. He exhaled deeply, his hands still clenched into fists at his sides. The familiar burn of injustice coursed through him, but this time he wasn't going to let it go. They had no idea who they had just dismissed, but soon they would. The following morning, the sun rose over the city, casting a soft golden light across the streets. But inside Jason Henderson's penthouse office, there was no warmth in the air, only a quiet, simmering focus. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the skyline. From this height, the world seemed small, insignificant, much like the dealership staff had made him feel the day before. But Jason knew better. He had been underestimated all his life, and yesterday's experience was just another reminder of the hurdles he still faced, even after reaching the pinnacle of success. He had given them the chance to show their true colors, and they had failed spectacularly. Now, it was time for him to show them his. Behind him, the door to the office clicked open. Jason didn't turn around, but he heard the familiar footsteps of his legal team entering the room. Gregory, his head lawyer, a tall, sharp-dressed man with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat softly, signaling his presence. "Everything is ready, Mr. Henderson," Gregory said, his voice professional and composed. "The financial team and public relations consultants are downstairs. We'll move forward as soon as you give the word." Jason finally turned, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside him. "Good," he said quietly. "It's time they learn who they were dealing with." Gregory nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had worked with Jason for years and knew the man well. When Jason had that look in his eyes, a look of determination mixed with righteous indignation, it meant things were about to change. Jason didn't lash out in anger. He moved with precision, with strategy, and that was exactly what they were about to do today. "I assume we're not going in guns blazing?" Gregory asked, though he already knew the answer. Jason chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "No, not quite yet. First, we let them squirm, then we'll apply the pressure." Gregory handed Jason a manila folder, thick with papers. "The dealership is owned by a private group, but you already know that. We've dug into their operations and found that they've had a few complaints of discriminatory practices in the past, though nothing that's gone public. With the evidence we have now, we could file a lawsuit that would draw immediate attention, but I suspect you have something else in mind." Jason flipped through the folder briefly, his mind racing through all the possibilities. The dealership thought they had seen the last of him when they asked him to leave. They assumed he was just another man they could dismiss without consequence. But Jason wasn't just another man, and today they would find out exactly who they had dismissed so easily. "I want to meet them in person," Jason said, his voice steady. "But this time, we're doing it on my terms." Gregory's smile widened slightly. "Understood. I'll notify the team to get ready." With that, Gregory turned to leave, and Jason took a moment to gather his thoughts. He could already picture the looks on their faces. Tom, the condescending salesman, and Marcus, the security guard who had treated him like a criminal. They were about to learn that appearances could be deceiving. Jason grabbed his jacket, the same simple, unassuming one he had worn the day before, and headed toward the elevator. This time, though, he wouldn't be walking in alone. He would return with his full team in tow. His lawyers, his financial advisors, and the media consultants who were ready to document every second of what was about to happen. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about showing them that their assumptions, their prejudices, had consequences. As the elevator descended, Jason remained silent, his mind focused on the task ahead. By the time the doors slid open on the ground floor, his team was assembled and ready. Gregory stood at the front, flanked by two other lawyers, while behind them stood Jason's financial advisor, Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had helped Jason manage the vast empire he had built. Next to her, the PR team was already coordinating with the media outlets, ensuring that this event would not go unnoticed. "Let's go," Jason said, his voice cutting through the quiet murmurs. The group moved as one, exiting the building and stepping into the waiting black SUVs outside. The convoy pulled away from the curb, heading toward the dealership with quiet efficiency. Jason sat in the back seat, his fingers drumming lightly against his leg as he thought about the confrontation to come. This was no longer about buying a car. It was about making a statement, one that would ripple through the industry and beyond. When they arrived at the dealership, the atmosphere inside the showroom was as pristine as it had been the day before. The same sleek cars gleamed under the bright lights, and the same perfectly dressed salespeople were busy catering to their affluent clientele. But today, everything was about to change. Jason stepped out of the SUV, followed closely by his team. As they entered the dealership, heads began to turn. The sight of Jason, dressed the same as before, but now flanked by his legal and financial representatives, immediately drew attention. The staff, who had ignored him the day before, suddenly couldn't take their eyes off him. He strode through the showroom with a quiet confidence, heading straight for the sales desk, where Tom had been stationed the day before. Today, though, Tom wasn't there. Another salesman, younger and seemingly unaware of the events from yesterday, greeted him with a polite smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" the salesman asked, his tone courteous. Jason didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'd like to speak with Tom." The salesman blinked, surprised by the directness in Jason's voice. "Tom? He's in the back office. Would you like me to get him for you?" Jason nodded once, and the salesman quickly scurried away. Jason could feel the eyes of the staff on him, their curiosity piqued by the presence of his entourage. It wouldn't take long for them to realize that something significant was happening. Moments later, Tom appeared, his face carefully composed as he approached. But Jason could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed quickly by confusion. Tom had clearly not expected to see Jason again, let alone in such company. "Mr. Henderson," Tom said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good to see you again. What brings you back today?" Jason didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the showroom, letting the silence hang in the air. He could feel the tension rising as the staff began to realize that this wasn't just a casual visit. "I came back because I believe we have some unfinished business," Jason said finally, his voice low but firm. Tom's smile faltered, and he glanced nervously at Gregory and the others standing behind Jason. "Unfinished business," he repeated, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm not sure I understand." Jason took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Tom's. "Yesterday, you treated me like I didn't belong here. You made assumptions about me because of the way I looked. You, your staff, and your security guard all made it clear that I wasn't welcome." Tom's face went pale, the forced smile slipping entirely. He glanced around, clearly aware that other customers and staff were watching. "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding," Tom began. But Jason cut him off. "There was no misunderstanding," Jason said, his voice sharp. "You assumed that because I wasn't dressed like your usual clientele, I couldn't possibly afford anything in this dealership. You treated me with disrespect and disregard, and when I challenged that, your security guard tried to remove me." Tom swallowed hard, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Mr. Henderson, Again, Jason cut him off. "Let me make this clear. I am Jason Henderson, owner of Henderson Automotive Group. I own more dealerships across this country than you can count. Yesterday, I came in here as a customer, and you failed. Spectacularly." The color drained from Tom's face completely. Jason could see the realization dawning on him, the horror of what he had done sinking in. Behind Jason, Gregory stepped forward, holding out a document. "This," Gregory said, his voice cold and professional, "is a formal notice of intent to file a lawsuit against your dealership for discriminatory practices." Tom's eyes widened, and he looked at the paper in disbelief. "Lawsuit?" he stammered. "Mr. Henderson, there's no need for this." "Oh, there is," Jason interrupted, his voice calm but deadly serious. "You see, this isn't just about me. It's about how you treat people, how you judge them based on their appearance. This isn't the first time your dealership has faced complaints like this, but I promise you, it will be the last." The dealership was dead silent now. Everyone from the staff to the customers had stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. Jason could feel the weight of their attention, but he didn't falter. He was in complete control. "I'm not here for an apology," Jason continued, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Tom stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He had no words, no excuses, no way out. Jason turned slightly, addressing the rest of the staff. "This dealership will be restructured from the ground up. Every single one of you will go through mandatory training on how to treat customers with respect, regardless of their appearance. And if you can't do that, you won't be working here anymore." The staff exchanged nervous glances, some looking genuinely remorseful, others clearly shocked by the turn of events. Tom, still holding the lawsuit notice in his trembling hands, looked at Jason with wide eyes. "Please, Mr. Henderson, there must be something we can do to make this right." Jason's gaze hardened. "What you can do is learn from this. Change the way you treat people, because next time, I won't be so forgiving." With that, Jason turned and walked out of the dealership, his team following closely behind him. As he stepped outside into the bright sunlight, the weight of the previous day's frustration lifted. He had made his point, and now the real work would begin. Behind him, the glass doors of the dealership closed with a final, decisive click. The next few weeks passed like a whirlwind at the dealership, but for Jason Henderson, it was all part of the plan. He knew that change wasn't something you could implement overnight, especially when it came to dismantling deep-seated prejudices and behaviors. Yet, as he sat in his office, reviewing the reports from his team, he felt the satisfaction of knowing that his presence, his actions, had triggered something significant, something that couldn't be ignored. Down at the dealership, the atmosphere was completely different now. The staff, once so confident and self-assured, were walking on eggshells, their smiles no longer those of superiority but of uncertainty. Everyone knew that Jason Henderson wasn't just a wealthy customer. He was now their boss, or at least the man who controlled the fate of their employment. Jason leaned back in his chair, contemplating the reports on the dealership's operations that Sarah had sent over. She had meticulously outlined the steps they had taken to implement the reforms he had demanded. One thing was clear. The dealership was undergoing a transformation, whether they liked it or not. As promised, every employee at the dealership, from the salespeople to the security guards, was required to attend a comprehensive training program on racial sensitivity, discrimination, and customer respect. Jason had made sure to hire the best in the industry to conduct the training, professionals who were skilled at addressing unconscious bias and systemic discrimination. The courses were intense, with real-world case studies, role-playing exercises, and blunt conversations that forced each employee to confront their own prejudices. Tom, the salesman who had dismissed and disrespected Jason, was not exempt. In fact, Jason had made sure that Tom was one of the first to attend the training. The reports on Tom's progress were mixed. While he had attended the sessions, it was unclear whether he had truly absorbed the lessons or was simply going through the motions to save his job. The security guard who had loomed over Jason with suspicion and hostility, Marcus, was also subject to the mandatory training. Marcus had always been the silent enforcer, rarely engaging with customers unless he felt they were a threat. But now, with Jason's lawsuit hanging over the dealership and the changes in policy being implemented, Marcus was forced to reckon with the way he viewed people like Jason, not just as potential criminals, but as individuals worthy of respect. Jason had made it clear to the management that if Marcus showed any resistance to the new policies, he would be let go. It wasn't just about saving face. It was about creating a culture where every person who walked into that dealership was treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance. Sarah, Jason's trusted financial advisor, had been instrumental in monitoring these developments. She sent regular updates on how the dealership's financials were doing, how customer feedback had shifted, and whether the staff was adjusting to the new environment. From what Jason could tell, things were improving, but slowly. One of Sarah's reports caught Jason's attention. She had included a customer survey that was conducted just a few days after the changes were implemented. Several new customers had mentioned the difference in atmosphere at the dealership, noting how the staff seemed more attentive, more respectful. Some returning clients, however, commented on the noticeable tension among the staff, as if they were still learning to adapt to the new expectations. Jason couldn't help but smile. Change, after all, was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, Tom found himself in a position he had never expected. After years of coasting through his job, confident in his ability to judge clients based on their appearance, he now found himself under intense scrutiny. His actions with Jason had nearly cost him his job, and he knew it. The weight of his mistakes hung heavily on him every day as he walked through the showroom, his usual swagger replaced by uncertainty. He had sat through the training sessions, his arms crossed defensively, his mind racing with thoughts of how unfair it all seemed. But something had started to shift inside him. Watching the videos of customers, real people, recounting their experiences of being judged and dismissed, something clicked. For the first time, Tom found himself questioning his own actions. Had he really been that blind, that dismissive? He remembered Jason's words, the quiet authority with which he had spoken when he revealed his true identity. Tom had underestimated him. More than that, he had disrespected him. And not just because Jason was wealthy, but because he had failed to see him as an equal. The shame of that realization settled in Tom's gut, a heavy, uncomfortable weight that he couldn't shake. He had always prided himself on being a good salesman, but now he was forced to confront the fact that he had been selling something else entirely, his own biases, his own preconceptions. Marcus, too, was struggling. The mandatory training had forced him to confront the way he had treated Jason, and it was an eye-opener in ways he hadn't anticipated. Marcus had always thought of himself as someone who was just doing his job, protecting the dealership, making sure that the wrong people didn't cause trouble. But now, looking back, he saw how wrong he had been. The training made him realize that his actions weren't about protection at all. They were about control, about making assumptions based on skin color and appearance. It was hard to admit, but Marcus had treated Jason as a threat simply because he was black and didn't fit the profile of the dealership's usual clientele. And now, he was paying the price for that assumption. He was grateful that he hadn't lost his job, but the thought of what could have happened haunted him. Marcus had a family to support, and the idea of being fired because of his prejudices scared him. He didn't want to be that person, the person who made judgments without knowing the full story. Marcus had spent years on the job, scanning faces, sizing people up with a glance. He had prided himself on his ability to assess a situation quickly, to keep things under control. But Jason's presence, his quiet confidence, had thrown him off balance. Marcus realized now that it wasn't about protecting the dealership. It was about protecting his own fragile sense of authority. Across the dealership, the ripple effects of Jason's intervention were felt in every department. Some employees embraced the changes eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to learn and grow. Others, however, resisted. They saw the training as unnecessary, even punitive. A few whispered among themselves, wondering if Jason's actions were an overreaction, if they were being unfairly targeted. But Jason knew that real change didn't come without discomfort. The staff needed to feel that tension, that pressure to be better. It was the only way to root out the deep-seated prejudices that had been allowed to fester for so long. While the dealership underwent its transformation, Jason was far from finished. He wasn't just interested in changing one business. He wanted this experience to serve as an example, a blueprint for how industries could address the issue of racial bias and discrimination. Jason worked closely with Sarah and the dealership's management to implement new, stricter standards for customer service. Every customer, regardless of their appearance, was to be treated with the utmost respect and professionalism. Secret shoppers were hired to visit the dealership, posing as clients of varying backgrounds, to test how well the staff adhered to these new standards. Any deviation from the expected level of service was reported directly to Jason. The results were mixed at first. Some staff members excelled, eager to prove that they had learned from their mistakes. Others struggled, their ingrained biases surfacing in subtle ways. Jason didn't waver. He knew that this was a process, and that it would take time to fully root out the old ways of thinking. In addition to the internal changes, Jason spearheaded a customer outreach campaign. He wanted the public to know that this dealership, and eventually all of his dealerships, would be places where every person was treated with dignity and respect. Advertisements were run in local media, highlighting the changes and inviting customers from all walks of life to experience the new, inclusive environment. The campaign was met with mixed reactions. Some applauded the effort, while others remained skeptical, unsure if real change was possible in such an entrenched industry. Jason didn't let the doubters deter him. He knew that actions spoke louder than words, and in time, the results would speak for themselves. As the dealership continued its transformation, both Tom and Marcus faced a crucial decision. They had undergone the training, they had confronted their own biases, but now they had to decide if they were willing to truly change, or if it was time for them to move on. Tom, after weeks of self-reflection, made his decision. He wasn't proud of how he had acted, But he knew that walking away wouldn't fix anything. He had been given a second chance, a chance to be better, to prove that he could change. He approached Jason directly one afternoon, standing in the very showroom where he had once dismissed him. "Mr. Henderson," Tom began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity, "I want to apologize again for the way I treated you. I know that words aren't enough, but I'm committed to making things right. I'd like to stay and continue working under the new guidelines. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm willing to do the work." Jason studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then with a nod, he spoke. "Tom, actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about changing, then prove it." Tom nodded gratefully, understanding the gravity of what Jason was offering him. A chance to redeem himself, not just in his career, but as a person. Marcus, on the other hand, struggled more with his decision. The training had forced him to confront parts of himself that he didn't like. He had built his identity around being the strong, silent protector. But now he realized that his actions had been rooted in fear and bias. Marcus wasn't sure if he could fully change, but he didn't want to be the person he had been anymore. After much deliberation, Marcus approached Jason as well. "Mr. Henderson, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. I know I messed up. I don't know if I'm the right person to keep working here, but I don't want to leave without trying to make it right. I just want you to know that I'm committed to doing better." Jason looked at Marcus, seeing the conflict in the man's eyes. He respected Marcus's honesty, and though he wasn't entirely sure if Marcus could make the change, he was willing to give him the opportunity. "Let's see how you do," Jason said. "But if I see any sign that you're slipping back into old habits, you'll be out. Understood?" Marcus nodded solemnly. Understood. As the weeks turned into months, the dealership continued to evolve. The training sessions became more than just mandatory. They became part of the dealership's DNA. New employees were hired with a clear understanding of the expectations, and those who couldn't meet those standards were quietly let go. For Jason, the transformation was more than just a victory for his business. It was a small but meaningful step toward a larger goal, creating a world where people were judged not by their appearance, but by their character. And while the battle was far from over, Jason knew that he had made a difference, one dealership at a time. Several months had passed since Jason Henderson's quiet, yet powerful confrontation with the dealership. The transformation that had begun as a ripple had now turned into a wave of change, not just at this particular dealership, but across the entire chain of luxury dealerships under his ownership. The changes were tangible, in the way customers were treated, in the way staff members engaged with each other, and in the overall atmosphere of the business. Jason sat in his office, gazing out over the city skyline. The dealership he had once walked into as an ordinary man, disguised in simple clothes, had become a symbol of what could happen when someone chose not to accept the status quo. What had begun as a personal challenge, a test to see how people treated him when they didn't know his wealth, had evolved into something much larger. His phone buzzed on his desk, breaking the silence. It was Sarah, his financial advisor and trusted colleague. "Jason, I just got the latest reports," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of excitement. "Customer satisfaction is through the roof. We've been getting rave reviews about the changes at the dealerships, and we're seeing a significant increase in returning clients. Whatever you did, it's working." Jason smiled slightly, but there was no sense of victory in his expression, just quiet satisfaction. "That's good to hear, Sarah. But there's still a lot of work to be done." Sarah chuckled. "Of course, you're always thinking ahead, But seriously, the numbers are impressive. You've not only turned that one dealership around, but you've set a new standard for the entire company. The impact is bigger than even we expected." Jason nodded to himself, knowing she was right. The journey hadn't been easy, and there had been resistance, both from within and outside the dealership. But the results spoke for themselves. "Keep me updated," Jason said before hanging up. Across town, the dealership that had once been the epicenter of Jason's quiet storm was nearly unrecognizable from the way it had been months earlier. The sleek cars still gleamed under the bright lights, the marble floors still reflected the luxury of the space, but something fundamental had changed. The staff now moved with a different energy, not one of superiority or cold detachment, but of genuine professionalism and respect. Customers, regardless of how they dressed or what they looked like, were greeted with the same welcoming smiles and courteous service. The tension that had once filled the air had dissipated, replaced by a sense of fairness and inclusion. Jason's reforms had taken root. The mandatory sensitivity training was now an integral part of every employee's onboarding process. New hires were carefully vetted, not just for their experience in sales, but for their commitment to the values Jason had instilled. The dealership's policies were clear. Discrimination of any kind would not be tolerated, and any employee who crossed that line would face swift consequences. Tom, the salesman who had initially dismissed Jason, had undergone a profound transformation of his own. The training sessions had forced him to look inward, to confront the biases he had long denied. He hadn't realized how much of his behavior had been shaped by unconscious judgments until he was forced to see it from the other side. Months later, Tom was still at the dealership, but he was a different man. He was more attentive, more empathetic, and far more respectful in his interactions with customers. He had even started mentoring new employees, helping them understand the importance of treating every customer with dignity. It was his way of atoning for the mistakes he had made. And while he still carried the weight of those mistakes, he was determined to make things right. Jason had kept a close eye on Tom's progress, and though he wasn't the type to offer praise easily, he had been quietly impressed. Tom had risen to the challenge, and while there was still room for growth, Jason knew that Tom had genuinely changed. Marcus, the security guard, had also remained at the dealership. The training had hit him hard, forcing him to confront not only how he had treated Jason, but how he had treated countless others over the years. Marcus had prided himself on being vigilant, on keeping the dealership safe, but now he realized that he had been protecting the wrong thing. He had been protecting his own assumptions, his own prejudices, and in doing so, he had alienated and disrespected people who had done nothing wrong. Over time, Marcus began to approach his job differently. He still kept a watchful eye on the dealership, but now his vigilance was tempered with understanding. He no longer made snap judgments about customers based on their appearance. Instead, he engaged with them, offering help when needed and stepping back when it wasn't. He had earned a second chance, and like Tom, he was determined to use it wisely. For the customers, the change was palpable. The dealership, once known for its exclusivity and coldness, was now a place where everyone felt welcome. Jason's reforms had created a ripple effect throughout the business, and word began to spread. New customers, many of whom had heard about the dealership's transformation, began to flock to the showroom, eager to see the changes for themselves. One afternoon, a young black woman walked into the dealership, her face a mixture of hope and trepidation. She had heard about the incident with Jason and how it had led to the sweeping reforms, but she wasn't sure if things had truly changed. As she browsed the cars, she was approached by a salesman, the same Tom who had once dismissed Jason. "Good afternoon," Tom said, his voice warm and genuine. "Is there anything I can help you with today?" The woman hesitated for a moment, studying him carefully. She had heard the stories about how this dealership had once treated people like her, and she wasn't sure if she could trust it. But there was something in Tom's demeanor that felt different. Something that felt sincere. "I'm just looking," she said cautiously. Tom nodded, not pressing her for more. "Take your time. If you have any questions, I'll be right here." She watched as he stepped back, giving her space, but remaining attentive. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe in a place like this. As she continued to browse, another employee approached her, Marcus, the security guard. But instead of watching her with suspicion, he greeted her with a respectful nod and a soft smile. "Let me know if you need any assistance," he said, his voice kind. The woman left the dealership that day without buying a car, but she left with something more valuable, the knowledge that places like this could change, that people could change. And when she did decide to make a purchase, she knew exactly where she would return. Back in his office, Jason sat in quiet reflection. The changes at the dealership were only the beginning. He had always known that success wasn't just about making money. It was about using that success to create something meaningful, something that could leave a lasting impact. This entire experience had been a lesson, not just for the dealership staff, but for Jason himself. It had reminded him of the importance of patience, of perseverance, and of the power of quiet defiance in the face of injustice. He had walked into that dealership as an ordinary man, dressed in simple clothes, and he had been treated like he didn't belong. But he had shown them that worth wasn't defined by appearances. It was defined by actions. And in the end, it wasn't just about proving a point. It was about creating a legacy of fairness, respect, and equality. Jason's thoughts turned to the future. He had already begun implementing similar reforms across his other dealerships, ensuring that the changes he had made here would ripple outwards. He knew that not every place would accept these changes easily, but he wasn't afraid of resistance. He had faced far worse in his lifetime, and he had always come out stronger on the other side. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. His reflection stared back at him, and for a moment he thought of the young man he had been, full of ambition, full of hope, but also full of doubt. The world had told him time and time again that he didn't belong, that he wasn't good enough, that his skin color and background would always hold him back. But he had proven them wrong, and now he was helping others do the same. The dealership had become more than just a business. It had become a symbol of what could happen when someone decided not to accept the way things were, but instead pushed for the way things should be. Jason knew that not everyone would follow his path, but he hoped that his actions would inspire others to look beyond appearances, beyond biases, and to see the potential in everyone. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the city, Jason felt a sense of peace. The battle for justice was never truly over, but today he had won a small victory, and that was enough. He turned away from the window, a faint smile on his lips. The world was changing, slowly but surely, and Jason Henderson was determined to be a part of that change, one dealership at a time. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Click on the bell to be the first to know about new videos. In the meantime, check out our other videos, which will not leave you indifferent.